On March 3, 1959, in a remote corner of Kenya's Coast Province, 11 men were beaten to death. Their names were Kabui Kaman, Ndungu Kibaki, Mwema Kinuthia, Kinyanjui Nyoroge, Koroma Mburu, Karanja Munuthi, Ikeno Ikiro, Migwi Ndegwa, Kaman Karanja, Mungai Githi, and Nugi Karitie. The British colonial government initially claimed they died from drinking contaminated water. That was a lie. What happened to these 11 men wasn't an accident, it wasn't an isolated incident, and it certainly wasn't about water. It was systematic, it was deliberate, and for decades, it was hidden. To understand how Britain came to operate a network of torture camps in Kenya, we need to go back to when these rolling highlands, some of the most fertile land in East Africa, belonged to the Kikuyu people. They had lived here for generations. The land wasn't just property to them, it was their identity, their history, their future. And then the British arrived. By the early 1900s, European settlers were flooding into Kenya. The colonial government didn't ask permission, they didn't negotiate. They simply took the land, the best land, and handed it to white settlers. Imagine waking up one day to find that everything your family had worked for, everything your ancestors had passed down to you, now belonged to strangers. Strangers who looked different, spoke a different language, and saw you as little more than cheap labor for what used to be your own soil. The Kikuyu were pushed onto reserves, barren, overcrowded patches of land that couldn't sustain them. Meanwhile, they watched white farmers prosper on the land that had been stolen from them. They were forced to carry passes. They couldn't move freely in their own country. They worked brutal hours for pennies while white settlers grew rich. By the end of World War II, something was brewing. Kikuyu veterans who'd fought for Britain against fascism returned home. They'd risked their lives for freedom and democracy. They'd seen the world, and when they came back to Kenya, they saw their reality for what it truly was: oppression, exploitation, theft.
Soldiers, we face great challenges ahead, but with vigilance and unity we will prevail.
At first, they protested peacefully. They formed political organizations. They demanded representation, land rights, basic human dignity. But the colonial government wasn't interested in listening. So in the early 1950s, a secret movement began to spread through the Kikuyu villages. They called it the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. The British called it Mau Mau. Members took sacred oaths, pledging to fight for their land and freedom. By 1952, upwards of 90% of the Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru people had taken these oaths. The British were terrified. Not because the Mau Mau were well armed, most carried homemade weapons, old rifles, spears, and machetes, but because an entire population was rising up, and entire people were saying enough. On October 20th, 1952, Governor Evelyn Baring declared a state of emergency. What followed would become one of the darkest chapters in British colonial history, a chapter they would spend decades trying to erase. In 1953, a British colonial official named Thomas Asquith was given a task: design a system to break the Mau Mau resistance. He called it the pipeline. It sounds bureaucratic, almost benign, like a public works project, but the pipeline was actually a vast network of detention and work camps designed to process human beings like factory goods, sorting them, categorizing them, breaking them down, and only releasing them when they had been completely remade into loyal colonial subjects. The British didn't just arrest suspected Mau Mau fighters, they detained entire communities, hundreds of thousands of people, men, women, children, the elderly. By 1954, 3 out of every 4 Kikuyu men were in detention. Think about that. 3 out of every 4. Nearly 1.5 million Kikuyu people, the entire ethnic group, were either imprisoned in detention camps or forcibly relocated into fortified villages surrounded by barbed wire.
Stay where you are! You will obey!
The pipeline worked like
They're
this.
moving out now.
When you were arrested, and
Keep
you
a
could be
close
arrested
watch.
for anything, being in the wrong place, knowing someone suspected of Mau Mau, refusing to inform on your neighbors, you were taken to a screening center. Screening, that's what they called it. But screening was just a polite word for interrogation through torture. Listen closely to
Everyone
this.
stay where you are.
Survivors describe being
Do not
beaten with
move.
clubs and rifle butts, having bottles shoved into their bodies, being burned with cigarettes, castrated, raped, forced to eat feces and drink urine. Women were stripped naked in front of crowds, sexually violated with bottles, snakes, and vermin. And this wasn't happening in secret, isolated cells.
now.
This was happening systematically,
back.
at scale,
Faster,
in
clear
dozens
the
of
area.
camps across Kenya. Langata, Minyani, Athi River, Karatina, Kamiti, Hola. The pipeline divided detainees into three categories. Whites were cooperative. They confessed, denounced the Mau Mau oath, and were released. Grays were taken the oath but could be broken. They were sent to work camps for rehabilitation. And then there were the blacks, the hardcore, those who refused to break. The hardcore were sent to special detention camps in the most remote parts of Kenya, places like Hola, in the barren, scorching Coast Province, places designed to destroy them. Here's what's crucial to understand. The British government knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't a few rogue soldiers or sadistic guards acting on their own. In 1957, Kenya's Attorney General, a British official named Eric Griffith Jones, sent a memo to Governor Evelyn Baring. In it, he authorized specific forms of violence against detainees. He described in clinical detail how resistors should be beaten, with a foot placed on the throat, mud stuffed in the mouth, and if necessary, knocked unconscious. And then he wrote this: "If we are going to sin, we must sin quietly. Sin quietly." They knew it was wrong. They knew it was criminal. They just didn't want anyone to find out. By 1959, the international community was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about Britain's conduct in Kenya. The detention camps were supposed to be rehabilitation centers, places where misguided Africans could be re-educated and returned to society as productive citizens. But at Hola Camp on the morning of March 3, 1959, the myth of rehabilitation was shattered forever. 85 detainees at Hola were classified as hardcore, men who had refused, despite years of detention and abuse, to renounce their oath. That morning, the camp commandant, acting on orders from senior officials, decided these men would be forced to work on an irrigation project. When the detainees refused, knowing that detainees were not legally required to perform forced labor, the guards were given a simple instruction: use force, whatever it takes. What happened next was brutal, swift, and predictable. Guards armed with clubs and batons descended on the unarmed men. They beat them for hours. Skulls were fractured, ribs were broken, internal organs ruptured from the repeated blows. By the time the violence stopped, 10 men lay dead or dying. An 11th would die from his injuries days later. 22 others required hospitalization. The initial British report claimed the deaths were caused by contaminated water. It took 3 days before Governor Baring admitted the truth. The men had been beaten to death. The autopsies were unambiguous. Each victim died from shock and hemorrhage due to multiple bruising caused by violence. There was no way to hide it, no way to spin it. This was murder. And it had happened under British authority, following British orders in a British detention camp. When news reached Britain, there was outrage, at least from some members of Parliament. Conservative MP Enoch Powell stood in the House of Commons and delivered a scathing speech. "We cannot have African standards in Africa, Asian standards in Asia, and British standards here at home. We cannot, we dare not, fall below our own highest standards." But despite the outrage, despite the clear evidence, despite the admissions, no one was prosecuted. Not the camp commandant, not the guards, not the colonial officials who had designed the system and given the orders. The Attorney General in Kenya claimed there wasn't enough evidence to bring charges. 11 men beaten to death in broad daylight, with witnesses, medical evidence, and a paper trail leading straight to the top of the colonial administration. And somehow that wasn't enough evidence. But the Hola massacre did something the British government couldn't control. It shattered the illusion of benevolent colonialism. The world could no longer ignore what Britain was doing in Kenya. The detention camps began to close, international pressure mounted, and within 4 years, Kenya would gain its independence. But the story didn't end there, because Britain wasn't done hiding what it had done. December 1963. Kenya was about to become an independent nation. But as the Union Jack was being lowered, something else was happening in government offices across the colony. British officials were systematically destroying evidence. In 1961, Colonial Secretary Ian MacLeod had issued a directive to all colonial governors. Any documents that might embarrass Her Majesty's government, that could expose torture or human rights violations, or that might be used unethically by ministers in the successor government should either be destroyed or secretly removed to Britain. They called it Operation Legacy. Thousands of files were burned. Thousands more were packed into crates and shipped to Britain, where they were locked away in a high-security government facility called Hounslow Park. 3.5 tons of documents were destroyed. Countless more were smuggled out of Kenya. The goal was simple: erase the evidence, rewrite the history, make sure the world would never know the full truth about what Britain had done. And for decades, it worked. But in 2009, something extraordinary happened. 4 elderly Kenyans, survivors of the detention camps, decided they had been silent long enough. Their names were Wambugu Waniingi, Paulo Muoka Nzili, Jane Mutoni Mara, and Nidiku Mutua. Wambugu had been castrated by his British captors. His testicles were cut so severely that they had shriveled completely, leaving him unable to have children. Jane had been subjected to horrific sexual violence, raped with bottles in front of other detainees. Paulo had endured years of beatings and psychological torture. These were not young people anymore. They were in their 70s and 80s, living in poverty, still carrying the physical and emotional scars of what had been done to them 50 years earlier. But they wanted something: recognition, an apology, justice. With the help of Kenyan lawyers and the London firm Lay Day, they sued the British government. Britain's response was predictable. They tried to have the case thrown out. First, they argued that responsibility for colonial actions had transferred to the Kenyan government at independence. The court rejected that. Then they argued that too much time had passed, that a fair trial was no longer possible. The court rejected that too. And then something remarkable happened. The court ordered the British government to produce any evidence related to the Mau Mau detention camps. The Foreign Office insisted they had nothing. That was a lie. Under pressure from historians and legal teams, the British government finally admitted that they had been hiding a secret archive. At Hounslow Park, a high-security government complex in Buckinghamshire, they had stored thousands of files from Kenya and 36 other former colonies. 8,800 documents. Files that were supposed to have been destroyed or handed over to Kenya at independence. Files that contained evidence of everything: the torture, the systematic abuse, the chain of command leading directly to London. Minutes from war councils discussing interrogation techniques, reports detailing castrations, sexual violence, beatings, orders from British officials authorizing violence. Everything the survivors had testified to, everything Britain had denied for 50 years, was there in black and white. One document described prisoners being sodomized with broken bottles. Another detailed how vermin and snakes were used as instruments of torture. The records confirmed, almost word for word, the testimonies of survivors whom the British government had dismissed as liars. They had known. They had documented it. They had hidden it. And they had called the survivors liars. The Mau Mau Uprising began as a fight for land and freedom. It ended with Kenya's independence in 1963, but the cost was catastrophic. An entire generation traumatized, families destroyed, communities torn apart, hundreds of thousands dead, and for decades their suffering was erased from history. What makes the Mau Mau torture camps Britain's hidden war crime isn't just the brutality of what happened, it's the systematic cover-up that followed. It's the destroyed documents, the denied accusations, the decades of calling survivors liars. It's the refusal to hold anyone accountable. The 2013 settlement was a step toward justice, but it wasn't justice itself, Because true justice requires more than compensation. It requires truth, full truth. It requires accountability, real accountability. And it requires a commitment to never let this happen again. The young people of Kenya today are learning this history, not the sanitized colonial version, but the real story, told by the survivors themselves. They're learning about their grandparents who resisted, who endured, who survived. And they're asking the same questions we should all be asking. How many other hidden war crimes are still buried in government archives? How many other survivors are still waiting for their truth to be acknowledged? And what responsibility do nations have to reckon with their violent past? Kabui Kaman, Ndungu Kibaki, Mwema Kinuthia, Kinyanjui Nyoroge, Koroma Mburu, Karanya Munuthi, Isikeno Ikiro, Migwi Negwa, Kaman Karanya, Mungai Githi, Ngugi Karieti. These were their names. I'm sorry, I know I'm not getting the pronunciation right. Forgive me. But always remember them. Because when we forget the crimes of the past, we make it easier for them to happen again.